Sleeping Beauty. Once upon a time there lived a king and queen who wished for a child. It happened one day that as the queen was bathing, there came a frog out of the water, and he squatted on the ground and said to her,
"Your wish shall be fulfilled. Before 1 year has gone by, you will have a beautiful daughter."
And as the frog foretold, so it happened. And the queen had a daughter, so beautiful that the king could not contain himself for joy, and he celebrated with a great feast. Not only did he invite his relatives, friends, and acquaintances, but also the wise women, that they might be kind and favorable to the child. Now there were 13 of them in his kingdom, but as he had only provided 12 golden plates for them to eat from, one of them was left out. However, the feast was celebrated with all splendor, and as it drew to an end, the wise women stood forward to present to the child their wonderful gifts. One bestowed virtue, another beauty, a third riches, and so on whatever there is in the world to wish for. After the 11th had spoken, in came the uninvited 13th. Burning with rage, and without greeting or respect, she cried out in a loud voice,
"When she is 15 years old, the princess will prick her finger with a spindle, and she will fall down dead."
And without speaking one more word, she turned away and left the hall. Everyone was terrified, and when the 12th came forward, for she had not yet bestowed her gift, she said solemnly,
"Though it is beyond my powers to reverse the evil prophecy, I can lessen it. The princess shall not die, but fall into a deep sleep for 100 years.
Now the king, wanting to save his child even from this misfortune, gave orders that all the spindles in his kingdom should be destroyed. The princess grew up, adorned with all the gifts of the wise women, and she was so lovely, modest, sweet, and kind and clever, that no one who saw her could help loving her. It happened one day, when she had become 15 years old, that the king and queen were away, and the young princess was left behind in the castle. She wandered about into all the nooks and corners, and to all the parlors and chambers, till at last she came to an old tower. She climbed the narrow winding staircase, which led to a little door with a rusty key sticking out of the lock. She turned the key, and the door opened, and there in the little room sat an old woman with a spindle, spinning her flax.
Good day, dear woman. What is it that you are doing? I am spinning flax. What is that thing that twists round so quickly?
And then she took the spindle into her hand and began to spin. But no sooner had she touched it than the evil prophecy was fulfilled, and she pricked her finger with it. That very moment she fell back upon the bed that stood there, and lay in a deep sleep. And this sleep fell upon the whole castle. The king and queen, who had just returned, and were in the great hall, fell fast asleep, and with them the whole court. The horses in their stalls, the dog in the yard, the pigeons on the roof, the flies on the wall, and the very fire that flickered on the hearth became still, and slept with the rest. The meat on the spit stopped roasting, and the cook, who was about to whack his assistant on the head with a frying pan, stopped in mid-air and fell asleep. And outside, the wind stopped, and not a leaf fell from the trees around the castle. Then around the castle there grew a hedge of thorns, and they grew thicker and thicker each year, until at last the whole castle was hidden from view. and nothing of it could be seen but the weather vane on the roof. A rumor went around the whole of the country of the Sleeping Beauty, and from time to time many kings' sons came and tried to force their way through the hedge. But it was impossible, for the thorns were so strong and tangled together, and the young men were caught by them, and not being able to get free, died a horrible death. Many years after, there came a king's son into that country, and heard an old man tell how there was an old castle standing behind the hedge of thorns, and that there was an enchanted princess, known as Sleeping Beauty, who had slept for 100 years, with the king and queen and the whole court. The old man had been told by his grandfather that many kings' sons had tried to get through the thorn hedge, but had been caught and pierced by the thorns and died. To this the young prince replied,
"Even so, I am not afraid to try. I shall get through and see the lovely Sleeping Beauty."
The kind old man tried to dissuade the young prince, but he would not listen. It happened that this day the 100 years were at an end, and when the prince drew near the hedge of thorns, it was changed into a hedge of beautiful flowers, which parted and bowed to let him pass, and then closed again behind him in a thick hedge. When he reached the courtyard, he saw the horses and hunting dogs lying asleep, and on the roof the pigeons were sitting with their heads under their wings. And when he came indoors, the flies on the wall were asleep. The cook in the kitchen had his hand uplifted to strike his assistant, and the kitchen maid had a black chicken on her lap, ready to pluck. Then he entered the great hall and saw the king and queen. And still he went further, and all was so quiet that he could hear his own breathing. And at last he came to the tower, and went up the winding stair, and opened the door of the little room where Sleeping Beauty lay. And when he saw her looking so lovely in her sleep, he could not turn away his eyes, and he bent over and kissed her. She awakened immediately, and opened her eyes and looked very kindly on him. Then the king and the queen and the whole court woke up, and looked at each other with great wonderment. The horses in the yard shook themselves. The hounds sprang up and wagged their tails. The pigeons on the roof drew their heads from under their wings and flew into the fields. The flies on the wall awakened, and the kitchen fire leapt up and blazed and cooked the meat. The cook gave his assistant such a blow that he cried out with pain, and the maid went on plucking her chicken. Then the wedding of the prince and Sleeping Beauty was held with all splendor and celebration, and they lived very happily for the rest of their lives. The end. Idleness and Industry. There was once on a time a maiden who was pretty, but idle and negligent. When she had to spin, she was so out of temper that if there was a little knot in the flax, she at once pulled it out of the whole heap, and strewed it about on the floor beside her. Now she had a servant who was industrious, and gathered together the bits of flax which were thrown away, cleaned them, span them fine, and made a beautiful gown out of them for herself. A young man had wooed the lazy girl, and the wedding was to take place. However, on the eve of the wedding, the industrious one was dancing merrily about in her pretty dress, and the bride said,
"Ah, how that girl does jump about dressed in my odds and ends."
When the bridegroom heard that, and asked the bride what she meant by it, then she told him that the girl was wearing a dress made of the flax which she had thrown away. When the bridegroom heard that, and saw how idle she was, and how industrious the poor girl was, he gave up the lazy girl, and went with the other, and chose her as his wife. The end. The Brave Little Tailor. One morning, a little tailor was sitting on his board near the window, and working cheerfully with all his might, when an old woman came down the street crying,
"Good jelly for sale! Good jelly for sale!"
The cry sounded pleasant in the little tailor's ears, so he put his head out of the window and called out, "Here, my good woman, come here if you want a customer." So the poor woman climbed the steps with her heavy basket, and was obliged to unpack and display all her pots to the tailor. He looked at every one of them, and lifting up the lids, applied his nose to each, and said at last, "The jelly seems pretty good. You may weigh me out 4 half-ounces, or I don't mind having 1/4 of a pound." The woman, who had expected to find a good customer, gave him what he asked for, but went away angry and grumbling. "This jelly is the very thing for me. It will give me strength and cunning." And he took down the bread from the cupboard, cut a hole round off the loaf, and spread the jelly on it, laid it near him, and went on stitching more gallantly than ever. All the while, the scent of the sweet jelly was spreading throughout the room, where there were quantities of flies, who were attracted by it, and flew to partake. "Now then, who asked you to come?" said the tailor, and drove the unbidden guests away. But the flies, not understanding his language, were not to be rid of quickly, and returned in larger numbers than before. Then the tailor, not being able to stand it any longer, took from his chimney corner a ragged cloth, and saying, "Now I'll let you have it," beat it among them unmercifully. When he ceased and counted the slain, he found 7 lying dead before him. "This is indeed something," he said, wondering at his own gallantry. "The whole town shall know this." So he hastened to cut out a belt, and he stitched it, and put on it in large capital letters, 7 at one blow. "The town, did I say? The whole world shall know it." And his heart quivered with joy like a lamb's tail. The tailor fastened the belt round him, and began to think of going out into the world, for his workshop seemed too small for his worship. So he looked about him, all the house, for something that would be useful to take with him. But he found nothing but an old piece of cheese, which he put in his pocket. Outside the door, he noticed that a bird had got caught in the bushes. So he took that, and put it in his pocket with the cheese. Then he set out gallantly on his way, and as he was light and active, he felt no fatigue. The way led over a mountain, and when he reached the topmost peak, he saw a terrible giant sitting there, and looking about him at his ease. The tailor went bravely up to him, called out to him, and said, "Comrade, good day. There you sit looking over the wide world. I am on my way thither to seek my fortune. Have you fancy to go with me?" The giant looked at the tailor contemptuously, and said,
"You little rascal! You miserable fellow!"
"That may be," answered the little tailor, and undoing his coat, he showed the giant his belt. "You can read here whether I am man or not." The giant read,
7 at one blow!
and thinking it meant men that the tailor had killed, felt at once more respect for the little fellow. But as he wanted to prove him, he took up a stone and squeezed it so hard that water came out of it.
Now you can do that. That is, if you have the strength for it.
"That's not much. I call that play." and he put his hand in his pocket and took out the cheese and squeezed it, so that the whey ran out of it. "Well, what do you think of that?" The giant did not know what to say to it, for he could not have believed it of the little man. Then the giant took up a stone and threw it so high that it was nearly out of sight.
"Now, little fellow, suppose you do that."
"Well thrown, but the stone fell back to earth again. I will throw you one that will never come back." So he felt in his pocket, took out the bird, and threw it into the air. Now the bird, when it found itself at liberty, took wings, flew off, and returned no more. "What do you think of that, comrade?"
"There is no doubt that you can throw, but we will see if you can carry."
He led the little tailor to a mighty oak tree, which had been felled, and was lying on the ground, and said,
"Now, if you are strong enough, help me carry this tree out of the wood."
"Willingly. You take the trunk on your shoulders, and I'll take the branches with all their foliage. That is much the most difficult." So the giant took the trunk on his shoulders, and the tailor seated himself on a branch, and the giant, who could not see what he was doing, had the whole tree to carry, and the little man on it as well. The little man was very cheerful and merry, and whistled the tune, "There were 3 merry tailors riding by," as if carrying the tree were mere child's play. The giant, when he had struggled on under his heavy load, a part of the way was tired out, and cried,
"Look here, I must let go the tree."
The tailor jumped off quickly, and taking hold of the tree with both arms, as if he were carrying it, said to the giant, "You see, you can't carry the tree though you are such a big fellow." They went on together a little further, and presently they came to a cherry tree, and the giant took hold of the topmost branches, where the ripest fruit hung, and pulling them downwards, gave them to the tailor to hold, bidding him to eat. But the little tailor was much too weak to hold the tree, and as the giant let go, the tree sprang back, and the tailor was caught up into the air. When he dropped down again without any damage, the giant said to him,
"How is this? Haven't you strength enough to hold such a weak sprig as that?"
"It is not strength that is lacking. How should it be to one who has slain 7 at one blow? I just jumped over the tree because the hunters are shooting down there in the bushes. You jump it too if you can." The giant made an attempt, and not being able to vault the tree, he remained hanging in the branches, so that once more the little tailor had got the better of him. Then said the giant,
"As you are such a gallant fellow, suppose you come with me to our den and stay the night."
The tailor was quite willing, and he followed him. When they reached the den, there sat some other giants by the fire, and each had a roasted sheep in his hand and was eating it. The little tailor looked round and thought, "There is more elbow room here than in my workshop." And the giant showed him a bed, and told him he had better lie down upon it and go to sleep. The bed was, however, too big for the tailor, so he did not stay in it, but crept into a corner to sleep. As soon as it was midnight, the giant got up, took a great staff of iron, and beat the bed through with one stroke, and supposed he had made an end to that grasshopper of a tailor. Very early in the next morning, the giants went into the wood, and forgot all about the little tailor. And when they saw him coming after them alive and well, they were terribly frightened, and thinking he was going to kill them, they ran away in all haste. So the little tailor marched on, always following his nose. And after he had gone a great way, he entered the courtyard belonging to a king's palace, and there he felt so overpowered with fatigue that he lay down and fell asleep. In the meanwhile came various people, who looked at him very curiously and read on his belt,
7 at one blow. Oh, why should this great lord come here in a time of peace? What a mighty champion he must be.
Then they went and told the king about him, and they thought that if war should break out, what a worthy and useful man he would be, and that he ought not to be allowed to depart at any price. The king then summoned his council, and sent one of his courtiers to the little tailor to beg him, as soon as he should wake, to consent to serve in the king's army. So the messenger stood and waited at the sleeper's side, until his limbs began to stretch, and his eyes to open. Then he carried his answer back, and the answer was, "That was the reason for which I came. I am ready to enter the king's service." So he was received into it very honorably, and separate dwellings set apart for him. But the rest of the soldiers were very much set against the little tailor, and they wished him 1,000 miles away.
What shall be done about it?
They said amongst themselves.
If we pick a quarrel and fight with them, then 7 of us will fall at each blow. That will be no good to us.
So they came to a resolution, and went all together to the king, to ask for their discharge.
We never intended to serve with a man who kills 7 at one blow.
The king felt sorry to lose all his faithful servants because of one man, and he wished that he had never seen him, and would willingly get rid of him if he might. But he did not dare to dismiss the little tailor, for fear that he should kill all the king's people, and place himself upon the throne. He thought a long while about it, and at last made up his mind what to do. He sent for the little tailor, and told him that as he was so great a warrior, he had a proposal to make to him. He told him that in a wood in his dominions dwelt 2 giants who did great damage by robbery, murder, and fire, and that no man durst go near for fear of his life. But that if the tailor should overcome and slay both these giants, the king would give him his only daughter in marriage, and half his kingdom as dowry, and that 100 horsemen should go with him to give him assistance. That would be something for a man like me, thought the little tailor. A beautiful princess and half a kingdom are not to be had every day. And then he said to the king, "Oh yes, I can soon overcome the giants, and yet have no need of the 100 horsemen. He who can kill 7 at one blow has no need to be afraid of 2. So the little tailor set out, and the 100 horsemen followed him. When he came to the border of the wood, he said to his escort, "Stay here while I go to attack the giants." Then he sprang into the wood, and looked about him, right and left. After a while, he caught sight of the 2 giants. They were lying down under a tree asleep, and snoring so that all the branches shook. The little tailor, all alive, filled both of his pockets with stones, and climbed up into a tree, and made his way to an overhanging bough, so that he could seat himself just above the sleepers. And from there he let one stone after another fall on the chest of one of the giants. For a long time the giant was quite unaware of this, but at last he waked up, and pushed his comrade and said,
What are you hitting me for? You are dreaming. I am not touching you.
And they composed themselves again to sleep, and the tailor let fall a stone on the other giant.
What can that be? What are you casting at me? I am casting nothing at you.
They disputed about it for a while, but as they were tired, they gave it up at last, and their eyes closed once more. Then the little tailor began his game anew, picked out a heavier stone, and threw it down with force upon the first giant's chest.
This is too much!
And he sprang up like a madman, and struck his companion such a blow that the tree shook above them. The other paid him back with ready coin, and they fought with such fury that they tore up trees by their roots to use for weapons against each other, so that at last they lay both of them dead upon the ground. And now the little tailor got down.
Another piece of luck, that tree I was sitting in did not get torn up too, or else I should have to have jumped like a squirrel from one tree to another.
Then he drew his sword and gave each of the giants a few hacks in the breast, and went back to the horsemen and said,
The deed is done. I have made an end of both of them, but it went hard with me. In the struggle they rooted up trees to defend themselves, but it was of no use. They had to do with a man who can kill 7 at one blow. Then are you not wounded?
asked the horseman.
Nothing of the sort. I have not turned a hair.
The horsemen still would not believe it, and rode into the wood to see. And there they found the giants wallowing in their blood, and all about them lying the uprooted trees. The little tailor then claimed his promised reward, but the king repented him of his offer, and he sought again how to rid himself of the hero.
Before you can possess my daughter and half my kingdom, you must perform another heroic act. In the wood lives a unicorn who does great damage, and you must kill him.
A unicorn does not strike more terror into me than 2 giants. 7 at one blow, that is my way.
So taking a rope and an axe with him, he went out into the wood, and told those who were ordered to attend him to wait outside. He had not far to seek. The unicorn soon came out and sprang at him, as if he would make an end of him without delay.
Softly, softly, most haste, most speed.
And he remained standing until the animal came quite near. Then he slipped quietly behind a tree. The unicorn ran with all his might against the tree, and struck his horn so deep into the trunk that he could not get it out again, and so was taken.
Now I have you,
said the tailor, coming out from behind the tree, and putting the rope round the unicorn's neck. He took the axe, set free the horn, and when all his party were assembled, he led forth the animal and brought it to the king. The king did not yet wish to give him the promised reward, and set him a third task to do. Before the wedding could take place, the tailor was to secure a wild boar, which had done a great deal of damage in the wood. The huntsmen were to accompany him.
All right then, this is child's play.
But he did not take the huntsmen into the wood, and they were all the better pleased, for the wild boar had many a time before received them in such a way that they had no fancy to disturb him. When the boar caught sight of the tailor, he ran at him with foaming mouth and gleaming tusks to bear him to the ground. But the nimble hero rushed into a chapel, which chanced to be near, and jumped quickly out of a window on the other side. The boar ran after him, and when he got inside, the door shut after him, and there he was imprisoned, for the creature was too big and unwieldy to jump out of the window too. Then the little tailor called the huntsmen, that they might see the prisoner with their own eyes. And then he betook himself to the king, who now, whether he liked it or not, was obliged to fulfill his promise, and give him his daughter and half the kingdom. But if he had known that the great warrior was only a little tailor, he would have taken it still more to heart. So the wedding was celebrated with great splendor and a little joy, and the tailor was made into a king. One night the young queen heard her husband talking in his sleep, and saying,
Now, boy, make me that waistcoat, and patch those breeches, or I'll lay my yard measure about your shoulders."
And so, as she perceived of what low birth her husband was, she went to her father next morning, and told him all, and begged him to set her free from a man who was nothing better than a tailor. The king bade her to be comforted, saying,
"Tonight, leave your bedroom door open. My guard shall stand outside, and when he is asleep, they shall come in, and bind him and carry him off to a ship, and then he should be sent to the other side of the world."
So the wife felt consoled, but the king's water-bearer, who had been listening all the while, went to the little tailor and disclosed to him the whole plan.
"I shall put a stop to all this."
At night he lay down as usual in bed, and when his wife thought that he was asleep, she got up, opened the door, and lay down again. The little tailor, who only made believe he was asleep, began to murmur plainly,
"Now, boy, make me that waistcoat, and patch those breeches, or I will lay my yard measure about your shoulders. I have slain 7 at one blow, killed 2 giants, caught a unicorn, and taken a wild boar. And shall I be afraid of those who are standing outside my room door?"
And when they heard the tailor say this, a great fear seized them, and they fled away as if they had been wild hares, and none of them would venture to attack him. And so the little tailor remained a king all his lifetime. The end.